Thank you very much. I'm Tim Gordon. I'm halfway through doing a PhD at the University of Exeter and the Australian Institute of Marine Science. I'll be sharing, as mentioned, my work on coral reef bioacoustics on the Great Barrier Reef. I'll also be sharing some of the ideas I have for the rest of my PhD. It's a complete pleasure and an honor to be sharing that with you. So I'd like to thank the SEB for hosting, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming to listen. I would also like to thank this wonderful team of collaborating people, host institutes, and funding bodies who make this work possible. And not only do they make it possible, that they make it a complete joy to do. So I'm very grateful to all of them. Now, to start, I would like you to all imagine for a minute that you are a 2-week-old coral reef fish. Life starts as an egg on the reef, and almost immediately you're swept out into the open ocean. That's a good thing, because when you're there, you can avoid all the predators on the reef, and there's lots of plankton for you to eat, so in relative safety, you can grow up. You can develop your sensory ability, you can learn to swim, you can grow big and strong, and now you're the size of a tic-tac, and you're ready to take on the world. You're going to come back to a reef to start your adult life. But the big question facing you is, how on earth are you going to do that? You're a very small fish, it's a very big ocean, and you're in danger of being lost at sea. The answer to your question is it's a multifaceted solution. So at the start, there's passive dispersal involved. You drift along in ocean currents, but then at a certain point, sort of active dispersal kicks in, and you can go and actively try and find a reef. Now, you can see a coral reef, but only from about 25 meters away. You can't see very far underwater. You can smell a coral reef, but olfactory cues travel with currents, and so unless you're down current of reefs, that's not going to help an awful lot either. But crucially, you can hear a coral reef. Sound travels really far and really fast underwater. It travels almost independent of the direction of the current, and crucially, coral reefs are really noisy places. This is the sound of a reef croaker. This is the sound of an ambon damselfish. And this is the backing track of coral reef noise. That's thousands and thousands of snapping shrimps, all clicking their claws as they scurry around inside corals and sponges. You never see them, but if you put your head underwater on a coral reef, you'll hear these all the time. These sounds, and many others like them, combine to form what we call a soundscape, a collection, like a symphony of sound that can be heard from miles around. Juvenile fish can cue in on those sounds, and Nemo essentially hears his way home. Or at least, he used to. Around the world, coral reefs are degrading at unprecedented rates. Nowhere is this the case more so than the northern Great Barrier Reef. I work on Lizard Island, which is a small island in the middle of the northern Barrier Reef. And in a recent period of 4 years, it experienced degradation that was more severe than at any other point in its recorded history. In 2012, the reefs were relatively healthy. In 2014, Cyclone Ita swept through. This was the most severe cyclone to ever hit the northern Great Barrier Reef on record, and it went straight over the top of the island. The little anemometer on the island recorded the eye of the cyclone. The very next year, another cyclone came through. That prevented any recovery going on. Nathan, hit all the new recruits that were trying to start recovery after Ita. And then the year after that, or late 2015, early 2016, the now infamous global mass coral bleaching event. This single event killed 80% of the corals on Lizard Island in 3 weeks. It was massacre. In late 2016, I started my PhD. The first thing I did was I went to Lizard Island, and I listened to the reefs. I'm lucky to work in Steve Simpson's research group. He's been working at Lizard Island for several years, and so we were able to go through his old hard drives and access the old recordings that he had taken in 2012 when the reefs were relatively healthy. We then went back to the same places. We went at the same time of day, in the same season. We used the same recording equipment. We set it on the same settings. We had the same thing for lunch, and we wore the same swim shorts. You get the picture. We did everything the same, and we went and listened again. We wanted to know, had the sound changed? This is what we heard. Here's a Lizard Island reef in 2012. Here's the same reef 4 years later. That's one of the saddest things I've ever heard. You can hear coral reefs degrading. And as well as hearing it happen, you can quantify that change. We went through the literature, and these are 4 eco-acoustic indices. They're ways of putting numbers on soundscapes. In the top left, you've got acoustic complexity. That measures how different frequencies change in different bands over time. It's essentially a measure of the variability in a soundscape. Bottom left, you've got acoustic richness. That's essentially a measure of how many different types of sound there are. It's kind of like the diversity of the soundscape. Top right, snap rate. That's a measure of how many of those snapping shrimp clicks, the dominant sound source, how many of those are there per second. And bottom right, sound pressure level is essentially volume. On these graphs, each of those grey lines is an individual reef before and after degradation. Those boxes are the mean and the standard error, and those stars are a significant difference. And you can see, like you could hear, that the reefs are less complex, they are less diverse, there are fewer snaps, and they are quieter after degradation. It won't surprise you to hear, therefore, that when you put that into multivariate analysis, they group significantly, pre- and post-degradation. So you can hear a degrading reef, but we then wanted to know, what does that mean for Nemo hearing his way home? What impact might that have on fish recruitment? And when you think about fish recruitment, there are 2 inherently tractable phases to that process. There's the point where, you're a little fish in the top right of the screen there, and you're floating around in the blue, and you're sort of hearing cues or smelling cues and orienting towards them, but you're not necessarily directly settling, you're just going in the right direction. And then there's the point when you arrive on the reef and you make that decision to actually settle. And we can test those with 2 different methods. So the first one we test using light traps. That's essentially a box. I've got a picture. It looks like that. It's a box that floats in deep water. Sometimes it comes with a research assistant attached, if you're lucky. And it's got tapered slits in it, so the fish are attracted by the light, they swim in, and they can't swim out again. If you hang a loudspeaker off that, and then put several of them with different loudspeakers playing different things on them, you can test which sounds are most attractive to fish in the pelagic phase. And if you make patch reefs in a sandy area, you just put little piles of coral rubble out. You remove, there's no live coral on there, it's just rubble, and you scrub off all the seaweed, so there's no olfactory cues. And then you attach loudspeakers to them, then you can see how many fish are settling in response to each of the sounds. So we did both of those, and we set it up in the same triplicate experimental design. Each triplicate set had the pre-degradation, sort of relatively healthy-sounding 2012 reef noise, its equivalent degraded 2016 reef noise, and then ambient sound, which is just the sound of an empty ocean with no coral reef in it. It's essentially silence, but it's acting as a control for the fact that we've got an active loudspeaker in the water. On each of those replicates, each time we repeated it, we moved the sound treatment around the location of the triplicate to make sure that there wasn't a confounding factor of any sort of inherent bias towards one spot in our triangle. And we put in the day and the location and which of the tracks we were using in as fixed and random terms in our linear mixed models. And this is what we found. You would expect, if there was no impact of the sound, that you would get about a third of the fish on each of your reefs overall as an average. But in fact, and that's what that red line is. But in fact, you see this happening. We saw that you catch a significantly higher number of fish in light traps that are playing the sound of a healthy reef compared to those playing the sound of a degraded reef. And what's more, the degraded reef is no more attractive when put in that triplicate system than the sound of an empty open ocean. You get the same response in the patch reef experiments as well. That's looking at total fish count. We also wanted to break that down by looking at whether it's the same response for different types of fish. So looking at the light traps first, we looked at trophic gild. We split our fish into omnivores, herbivores, and carnivores. And you can see again, the dark blue bars are the healthy reef, and they are more attractive than the degraded reef or the ambient. That was the same for the patch reef's trophic gills. On the patch reefs, you catch slightly fewer fish than in light traps, so we didn't have the statistical power to test the same number of groups, but in all of the groups we did have the power to test, we found the same response. We then split it taxonomically as well. These are our 2 most abundant families. In the light trap experiment, we saw the same result there. And then we took the most abundant family, the damselfish, and took the most abundant genera in there. Again, the same response. The most abundant genus, the Pomocentris, we took the most common species, and again, the same response. We couldn't go to genus and species, but we could go to family in the patch reefs. And again, you're kind of sick of seeing this graph now, but the point is that in every group that we had the power to test, we found this ubiquitous response. Healthy reefs sound more attractive than degraded reefs to fish. It seems to be fairly ubiquitous, and that leads us to this worrying conclusion. We already know that disturbance events cause habitat degradation. And we already know that reduced recruitment and lower numbers of fish sort of exacerbate degradation as well, because reefs need their fish. They graze away algae, they form associations with invertebrates, they control trophic cascades. Fish are really important for reefs. Now what we have found happening is that as reefs degrade, they are quieter and they sound different. And those new sounds are less attractive to fish. And I would suggest that there is the potential for a concerning vicious cycle to be developing here. That is the rather depressing end of the first chapter of my PhD. I'm delighted to say that it's published here, and you can read more if you'd like. But I'm also delighted to say that this is only half of the story. This is where I am now. I have 2 years left, and I'm determined and inspired that there are another 2 years, in my PhD. And I would like to explore now how we can use acoustics not just as a sad symptom of decline, but as a tool for managing the future. To close my talk, I'm just going to give you 3 ideas that I'm working on at the moment to that end. Science is a team game, and I'd love us to play this together. So if any of you have any criticisms or questions or concerns or ideas or would like to collaborate or would like to fund us, then please do come and find me at the end. This is going to be a bit blue sky. Here we go. So first, I think we could use acoustics to monitor reefs. As our coral reefs are changing around the world, it's really important that we understand which ones are most likely to survive into the future, so we can prioritize their conservation. The 50 Reefs project is attempting to do that. They're using high-tech cameras to do advanced visual surveys around the world, trying to understand which reefs are most resilient and most resistant to climate change. But what if we could use acoustics as well? They're making these maps based on their visual surveys, but acoustics can tell you more. Acoustics can complement those visual surveys. You can hear fish that you never see on a reef, and you can listen for longer than you can, just do a snapshot visual survey. So you get taxonomic breadth and temporal depth from an acoustic survey too. I suggested this to Dr. Emma Kennedy, who's one of the senior scientists on the 50 Reefs program, and I'm delighted to say that last week she sent me this photo. She's currently in Indonesia, taking the first of the 50 Reefs acoustic surveys. The world's biggest coral reef survey is now operating under sound as well as by sight. The second idea is we could use acoustics to think more about reef connectivity. So, little thought exercise. Here's a healthy reef for you. It's got a nice healthy soundscape coming off it that goes a nice distance away from the reef. It's got a big sensory halo around it. We know that degraded reefs are quieter. Here's a degraded reef. You can hear it from less far away. If you randomly map fish larvae across space, then more fish can hear your healthy reef than your degraded reef, right? And you would expect, therefore, the source-sink dynamics of connected reefs to change. People are modeling source-sink dynamics at the moment all around the world. For instance, Pete Mumby's lab is modeling this around the Great Barrier Reef. They're using real data on ocean currents to try and predict which reefs are the important sources that might seed recovery of sink reefs. But all models so far make the inherent assumption that all reefs are equally attractive. We now know that that isn't the case because of this acoustic change, and so I would suggest, and I'm delighted to say that I spent 3 months last year in Brisbane discussing this with this group, and we are starting to work towards reparameterizing those models, updating them based on our new acoustic knowledge using real bleaching data to try and improve the accuracy of them. And finally, I'd like to suggest that as well as monitoring and modeling, we could use acoustics to help mitigate reef degradation. Rehabilitation projects are going on all around the world. I don't think anyone's under the illusion that we can regrow all of the coral reefs in the world with this sort of approach, but you can, on a local scale, replant, regrow corals, and re-establish some sort of community that will provide some of the ecosystem services that have been lost by coastal communities of people. Mars work in Indonesia. They do this, for example. So they take metal structures, they tie coral fragments onto them, they swim them down to the bottom of the sea, tie them together. At the start, they look like this, and 2 years later, they look like this. The coral regrows. And they hope that fish then come in and provide, it turns into some sort of functioning community for the fishing communities around there. What if you could use loudspeakers to speed that up? What if you could broadcast the sound of a healthy reef, attract in juvenile fishes faster, develop that community more quickly, and then speed up the whole process, deliver services to the communities faster? I don't know if it'll work, but I'm going to Indonesia next month to start that conversation. We'll see what happens. Thank you again for your attention. Sorry, I'm not done yet. I'm going to summarize in a slide in case anyone was asleep. So wake up and you can pay attention to this one slide. Reefs are degrading around the world. You can hear it happening, which is heartbreaking, and they are becoming less attractive to juvenile fish as a result of that. That has sort of concerning implications for the system, but it is also true that as well as being a symptom of decline and a mechanism of degradation, acoustics could be part of the solution. So as we look to the future, let's learn to listen. Thank you.